Well, welcome again to our Tuesday evening teaching sessions. We're spending time over these weeks looking at Genesis chapter 1 through to Genesis chapter 11. You'll be very well aware that of all biblical literature, Genesis 1 to 11 is probably the most debated. And as we saw last week, there are all sorts of different questions around it. What I wanted to do primarily in these sessions is not to avoid those questions. Hopefully I've addressed some of them at least elsewhere, but really focus in on what the author was trying to tell us through his stories. Really asking that question, what is the author's intention? What is he trying to inform us about? What questions is he seeking to address through his stories as they unfold? And so throughout these sessions, we're really just focusing in on those intentions, the intention of the author, and alongside that, maybe some of those big issues that he was trying to address, or they were trying to address through the way that they told these amazing stories for our benefit. In the first session, I sought to address a number of things that I believe the author was trying to tell us, to inform us about. The way that he uses structure and pattern and order in his narrative, in his story, to mirror image the creative activity of God, which of course also is structured, rhythmic, and of course ordered in the way that it's taking place as the account shows us. The narrative is also set in the context of the working week. That working week that would have been so familiar to people at the time, 6 days of work, the seventh day, the Sabbath, the day of rest. And then, of course, we went on to think about how, at that time, the setting for these stories, which was, of course, Mesopotamian, the acknowledgement that there were many different accounts of creation around at that time, what were known as the creation epics, the creation stories of the Mesopotamian people. And we wanted to really draw out some of those significant differences between the material that you would find in Mesopotamian literature at that time as opposed to the creation story. And I think we were able to see that the creation narrative that we have in Genesis chapter 1 is quite distinctively different to the ones that we find within Mesopotamian culture and literature. And then, of course, finally, the setting of the account, which sort of reaches its pinnacle, its defining moment in the goal of creation, which was the seventh day. But here we see that God comes to his temple being symbolic of creation. He comes to dwell in the midst of his creation, to rest within the midst of his creation. So what we're going to do in this particular session is we're really going to focus in again on Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 verse 3. And we're just going to take a look at some of that creative activity and see if we can find links between what's happening and, of course, the order that we're being presented with. Again, we're asking that question, why is the author structuring it in a particular way? What is he or they trying to tell us? So let's read again Genesis chapter 1 and through to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seeds in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons, and days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give them light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give them light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created great creatures of the sea, and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to its kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the birds of the sea, and the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. The introduction to Genesis chapter 1 sets the scene for all that is about to take place. That statement, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The author is using a Hebrew word, of course, and that word is bara. And the implication of the word bara is that something is being created out of nothing. And of course, throughout the account, the use of the word bara continues. Whenever we come across that phrase, God created, that is bara. It's the implication that what is being created is something out of nothing. God is seen almost like an artist with a blank canvas. He has total freedom, no limitations on his ability to create in whatever way he chooses. The author is telling us that God existed prior to all of this without any of the things that we now know. God was complete in himself. He wasn't reliant on the things that we need to make up our lives, to make up our world. God was complete in himself. He didn't need to coexist with anything else. The author really wants to tell us that God is apart from his creation. Although he's working his creation, he's certainly not contained within it. And of course, in creation, God will express his nature and his ability, his power in these creative acts. And he will continue to rework his creation, to sustain it, and to recreate as time moves on. Ultimately, the author really wants us to understand that right from the very beginning of the creation story, God is revealing something about his plan of salvation. The author wants us to see that the implication of the creation of the heavens and the earth is that there's that sense of a spiritual creation and a physical creation. But the author wants us to understand that they're not separate, that they interconnect, that they're related to each other. So in that way, we have a picture of a spiritual environment, the heavens, and a physical environment, the earth. But they remain connected together. So God is always connected with his creation. And we, his creation, are always connected to the Creator God. There is interaction between the two. And of course, the author is saying straight away that as heaven touches earth, so earth touches heaven. Earth reaches up into heaven. If God dwells in heaven, he certainly walks on earth in the midst of his creation. The author, right at the very beginning, is also telling us that something exists that is without form and void. Now, however we want to understand that, the author is clearly saying that what pre-existed prior to the succession of creative acts on God's behalf is chaotic. It's shapeless. It has no form. It's dark. And what God is about to do is to take that to bring about order and shape and form and light. God is creating a world that is capable of sustaining life out of a lifeless mass. But of course, that world that he creates will always be vulnerable to the invasion of chaos and darkness. In that first stage of creation, where we have that sense of something brought into existence that was without form and shape, where chaos seems to reign, it's almost as if the author is using that as an illustration of how very quickly order and structure that God creates can still very much be impacted by the chaotic and the dark. The relationship between the two remains. It just doesn't simply disappear. One can impact on the other. Now, that's only in terms of earth. That isn't true, of course, for heaven. The world that emerges out of that creative activity of God is not static. It's not changeless. It's open to continuous change. And of course, the Spirit of God is involved in that in an ongoing creative way, bringing about continuous creation and recreation. But the first image of that shapeless, without void, without form, is something that will continue to be connected and will have a future impact on the way that the story unfolds for us. The story, of course, is set in a series of stages. We could almost say those stages are stages of separation. There's an act of separation going on in each one of them. There are 3 stages of separation. Day 1, we see the separation of light from darkness. And that connects, of course, with day 4, where we see the creation of the sun and the moon. Day 2, we see the separation of the waters of the firmament of heaven and the waters below the heavens, which of course then leads on to day 5, the creation of birds and fish. Day 3, we see that God separates the dry earth from the sea, which of course leads then to day 6, where we will see how animal life and human life will be sustained. At the heart of the creative story here, the author really wants us to understand that there's a reproductive fertility about it all. It's an essential element of God's creation and his intentions for the world. Creation isn't static. It isn't a one-off event. It's an ongoing process. What God makes will be added to, will be multiplied. And of course, that is part of God's creative intentions, that creation is a continuing process to which layers are added to. I love the way that the author talks about the creation of the stars. In a very simple statement, he says, "And he made the stars also." Well, of course, the stars are incredible. There are billions of them. We're only really touching some of the dimensions of our universe, even now with all our scientific advancements. It's vast and we're not sure where it finishes. Probably doesn't finish anywhere in that sense. And here the author just deliberately says, and he made the stars also. It's almost like a sideshow. Why is the author doing that? Well, simply because, of course, stars were something that were very often worshipped within early civilization, within the environments in which these stories emerge. And the author deliberately plays down the significance of the stars so that it simply discourages us from seeing the stars as anything but beautiful and amazing, but not gods in their own right. It's God, the Creator God, who makes the stars. Let's move on now to think about the divine image. So what is the author trying to tell us, and why is this so important? Well, of course, over the years, people have had different views on the whole subject of the divine image. Some have argued that it means that we look like God in a physical sense. Well, of course, Scripture, in a helpful way, enabling us to relate to God, often talks about God's characteristics in human terms, that God has arms and feet and eyes and so on. But of course, we recognize that Scripture wants us to immediately understand that God is way beyond all of that, and he is way above all those physical features. It's just a helpful way of enabling us to relate to God. Sadly, some have also argued that the very statement, the image of God, implies that just as God has authority over his creation, he can do what he wants with his creation because he's God, he's the creator. So that implies that we as humans can also have authority over creation in the way that we can do what we want with creation. And of course, the implications of that, we're beginning to realize now that we're going to have to live with a lot of significant challenges, because in one sense we have misused creation and the role that we were called to play in it. When God calls upon humankind to rule over creation, he wants us to understand that we rule over it in the same way that he does. He cares for it. He manages it. He enhances it. He recreates it, and so on. It's something that we have been entrusted with, and something that we should reflect the creative desire of God in that particular way. I think for me, the use of that description of being created in the divine image, it just reminds us that we are God's fellow workers in his world. In other words, it has absolutely nothing, of course, to do with how we look, and it has nothing to do with some sort of carte blanche that you can do what you want with creation. We are God's representatives, and so we're to mirror God's intents, his nature, his desires, his purposes in the midst of his creation. Like God, we are to prove faithful and wise and benevolent and creative in the way that we care for all that God has given to us. In an ancient world, kings often were seen as being the representatives of God. Well, here the author is trying to tell us something even more significant than that. He's telling us that all human beings are representatives of God. In communion with him, our Creator, we become more and more like him. And of course, even though we recognize we're not the finished article, God is displaying something of his glory through our lives as our lives are brought into sync with his life. And in his creation, we are to enjoy creation in all its diversity and wonder. We are called upon to care for it and to manage it well and to enhance it in good and positive ways. The author very cleverly draws attention to something that he really wants us to focus in on, and that quite naturally is the creation of humankind. Verse 27 has a threefold and repetitive structure. It says the same thing 3 times. It doesn't add as it another layer as it goes through its 3 statements. And what it's simply implying, and I think the author wants us to do, is we're to hang out here and we're to wonder and to reflect and to meditate on the fact that God has created humankind in his image. It's a wonderful statement. It's a wonderful moment. And it stands apart from all the rest of the creative events, all the rest of the creative activity of God. There is something about the creation of humankind that is not contained within the rest of creation. And that's, of course, that we are created in the image of God. We are God's representatives in the midst of his creation. And that doesn't apply to any of the other elements of creation. And so at that moment, the author wants us to pause and to reflect on the significance of who we are and the way that God has made us, and how as God's representatives we can work in his world for the benefit of all, not only of humankind, but of all the elements of creation. What an incredible narrative the author has given to us. Its elements, its very structure, what the author is trying to tell us is so informative, so incredible, that it sets the tone for the whole of the rest of Scripture. Here we see something of a creator God. Here we see something of his plan of salvation. Here we see something of the wonder of his creative activity and his ongoing creative activity. And here we see ourselves set in the midst of his creation for the benefit and well-being of all creation, and to enjoy that unique relationship with the Creator God.